Hey guys, tonight we settle in and turn our attention to one of history's most polished and misunderstood figures, the medieval knight, the man in shining armor, the hero of poems, the defender of the weak, a symbol of honor, chivalry, and noble purpose. At least that's what the stories tell you. That's what the movies sell you. A world of gleaming swords, magnificent castles, and knights who were basically medieval superheroes. The truth, as it so often is, was a lot heavier, a lot smellier, and a whole lot more miserable. The shining armor wasn't a symbol of power. It was a prison, and the man inside wasn't a hero. He was just a man, sweating, bleeding, and probably desperate for a bathroom break. So, before we begin our journey, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe find a blanket. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we're not talking about legends. We're talking about reality. We're going to peel back the steel plates and look at the tired, aching, and deeply unglamorous man underneath. Let's begin. Let's start with the armor itself, the single most iconic part of being a knight. In your mind, it's a suit of articulated steel, perfectly fitted, a second skin that turns a man into an invincible warrior. It's a work of art, a testament to the blacksmith's skill. And it was also a 50-pound cage that you voluntarily strapped yourself into. Sometimes more, 60, 70 pounds, the equivalent of carrying a teenager on your back all day. Forget the idea of a knight gracefully leaping into a saddle. That was a fantasy. Getting dressed for battle wasn't a personal affair. It was a team project. It took 2 squires, sometimes more, working for the better part of an hour to assemble you. First came the padding, a thick, quilted tunic called a gambeson. Imagine wearing your winter duvet into a sauna. That was the first layer. It was meant to absorb the shock of blows, but mostly it just absorbed sweat. Then came the chainmail, a shirt, and sometimes leggings, made of thousands of interlinked iron rings. Another 30 pounds of dead weight that hung from your shoulders, pulling you down, restricting every breath. It was flexible, yes, but it offered no rest. It was a constant, wearying burden. And only then, on top of all that, came the plates, the solid steel pieces that made you famous. Greaves for your shins, sabatons for your feet, gauntlets for your hands, pauldrons for your shoulders, and of course, the breastplate and the helmet. Each piece had to be strapped, buckled, and tied into place. Your squires would be pulling leather straps tight, hammering in rivets, locking you into a shell that you could not escape from on your own. Once inside, your world changed. Your vision was reduced to a narrow slit in your visor, a tiny rectangle through which you were supposed to navigate a chaotic battlefield. You couldn't turn your head to see to your left or right. You had to turn your entire upper body. Your hearing was muffled, a distant world of echoes, and the sound of your own panicked breathing inside the steel box of your helmet. Movement was a slow, deliberate act of will. Every step was an effort. Lifting your sword arm felt like you were pulling it out of thick mud. You weren't a nimble warrior. You were a walking tank with the agility of a refrigerator. And you were hot, unbelievably hot. On a summer day, the inside of your armor could reach oven-like temperatures. The steel baked in the sun, turning your padded undergarments into a sweat-soaked sponge. Heat exhaustion wasn't a risk. It was a certainty. But the real terror came when you fell, and you would fall. Horses stumble. The ground is uneven. An enemy with a long poleaxe could hook your ankle and bring you down with a single pull. The moment you left your feet, gravity became your worst enemy. You wouldn't fall gracefully. You'd crash. A 50-pound suit of steel doesn't bend. It hits the ground with a deafening final thud. And then you were stuck. Imagine it. You're on your back, staring at the sky through that tiny slit. Your arms and legs are flailing, but the weight and awkward articulation of your armor make it impossible to get any leverage. You're like a turtle, flipped onto its shell, a helpless clanking beetle. You can't get up, not on your own. You are completely at the mercy of your squires finding you in the chaos of battle, or more likely, at the mercy of the enemy. While you were lying there, trapped in your expensive, custom-made prison, a peasant with a rusty dagger and nothing to lose would walk over. He wouldn't try to pierce your breastplate. He knew better. He'd simply flip up your visor, or find the gaps in the armor at your armpits or your groin, and with a quick, dirty little stab, it would all be over. Your shining armor didn't protect you. It just made you a more valuable and more helpless target. It wasn't a suit of armor. It was your coffin, and you paid a fortune to wear it. But the sheer crushing weight and the constant threat of helpless death weren't the only indignities of the cage. There were other problems, simpler, more human, problems that the epic poems and fireside stories conveniently forgot to mention, because heroes don't have bodily functions, but the man inside the armor did. So let's be blunt. Let's ask the question that no one ever asks in the movies. How did a knight go to the bathroom? The answer is not elegant. There was no clever system of flaps and buttons, no medieval convenience port. The blacksmiths who forged these magnificent suits were masters of protection, not plumbing. Once you were buckled in, you were in for the duration. A battle could last for hours. A siege could require you to be on guard at a moment's notice, fully armored, for half a day, and the human body doesn't wait. So what did you do? You had two options, and both of them were terrible. Option one was planning. Before the squires began the long process of strapping you in, you made sure you were as empty as possible. But battle is unpredictable. The call to arms might come suddenly, and the adrenaline, the fear, the sheer physical exertion of combat can have a powerful effect on the digestive system. Planning often failed, which led you to option two, the grim, unspoken reality. For most nights on a long campaign, you just went, right there, inside the armor. Think about that for a moment. You're standing on a battlefield, a symbol of nobility and Christian virtue. You're encased in a suit that cost more than a farmer's entire village, and you are slowly soiling yourself. The warmth spreading through the padded gambeson, the dampness seeping into the chausses on your legs. There was no dignity in it. It wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a matter of hygiene and health. The padded layers underneath the steel would become soaked, and they wouldn't be washed for days, maybe weeks. The fabric would chafe your skin raw. It would lead to rashes, sores, and infections. In a world without antibiotics, a simple skin infection could fester, leading to sickness, fever, and even death. You were more likely to be taken down by a bladder infection than by a dragon. And this wasn't a secret. Everyone knew. It was just part of the job. The squires who had to unbuckle you at the end of the day knew. They had to peel the damp, foul-smelling layers of padding off your body. It was one of the least glamorous parts of an already unglamorous job. Imagine the scene. After a battle, the fighting is over. You're exhausted, bruised, and bleeding. You stumble back to your tent. Your squires begin the laborious process of disassembly. They unbuckle the greaves, the gauntlets, the pauldrons. Each piece removed is a small relief. But then they get to the padded underlayers. The smell hits them. The damp, heavy fabric is peeled away. There was no hiding it. It was the great equalizer. No matter how noble your bloodline or how famous your name, you were still just a man, trapped by the same basic humiliating needs as the lowest peasant in the field. The romantic image of the knight, the clean, pure warrior, was a lie. He was a man fighting in a soiled, uncomfortable, and deeply undignified shell. The quest for the Holy Grail was probably a lot less about spiritual purity and a lot more about finding a moment to relieve yourself in peace. The shining armor wasn't just a physical prison. It was a prison of indignity. And if you think the physical discomfort was the worst part, if you think the weight and the bathroom problems were the peak of the misery, then you haven't considered the final, lingering consequence of being sealed inside that steel can. You haven't considered the one thing that followed a knight everywhere he went, the one thing that no amount of polish or perfume could ever hide: the smell. Let's be clear. Medieval times in general were not a fragrant era. Hygiene was a luxury, and the streets were open sewers. But even by those standards, the inside of a suit of armor was a uniquely foul environment. It was an ecosystem of stench, a personal mobile swamp of human odor that a knight carried with him like a cursed aura. It wasn't just one smell, it was a symphony of them, a complex blend of ingredients, all fermenting together in the hot, airless dark. Let's break down the recipe. The base note, the foundation of it all, was the gambeson, that thick, padded tunic worn under the metal. It was made of linen or wool, stuffed with rags or horsehair, and it was almost never washed. Maybe it was aired out by a fire if you were lucky, but a proper, thorough washing was rare. So it became a living record of every battle, every march, every moment of exertion. It soaked up sweat like a sponge, and that sweat never fully dried. It just festered, year after year, a scent of old, stale human effort. To that, you add the main ingredient, fresh sweat, gallons of it. Every single time you put the armor on, you started sweating. The fear, the adrenaline, the sheer physical work of moving 60 pounds of steel. The sweat would pour off you, soaking into the already saturated padding. It wasn't the clean sweat of a morning run. It was the thick, greasy sweat of terror and exhaustion. Then you add a metallic note, the smell of rust and oil. The armor had to be constantly maintained to prevent it from rusting shut. It was oiled and polished, and that smell of old grease and metal would seep into everything. And when it did rust, as it inevitably would in the damp joints and hidden crevices, it added a sharp, coppery tang to the air. Next, you add the smell of leather. The dozens of straps and buckles that held the whole contraption together were made of tanned animal hide. When that leather got wet with sweat and rain, and then dried, and then got wet again, it developed its own pungent animalistic funk. And finally, you add the top notes, the results of the problem we just discussed: the sharp, ammoniac smell of stale urine, the faint but unmistakable odor of human waste, all of it trapped, sealed inside the metal plates, cooking in the heat of your own body. Imagine the moment when a knight, after a long day of fighting, finally reached his tent and a squire lifted the helmet from his head. It wouldn't be a heroic reveal. It would be a blast wave of concentrated stench, a cloud of foul air so potent it could make your eyes water. The man emerging from the armor wasn't a shining hero. He was a biohazard. This wasn't just an unpleasant side effect. It had real consequences. It was a constant companion. The knight lived inside this cloud of his own making. It would cling to his hair, his skin, his clothes, even when he wasn't wearing the armor. And it created a barrier between him and the rest of the world. People could smell a knight coming long before they could see him. The epic poems speak of ladies swooning over knights. In reality, they were probably just trying to hold their breath. The image of a knight kneeling before his queen was probably a trial for everyone involved. His armor didn't just protect him from swords, it protected everyone else from having to get too close. The smell was his true defense, a silent, invisible wall that announced his presence and his profession in the most visceral way possible. It was the scent of the job, not glory, not honor, just stale sweat, rust, and human filth, all trapped together in a shining steel cage. So you've survived the battle. You've been peeled out of your stinking, soiled armor. You are bruised, exhausted, and probably bleeding from a dozen small cuts. Now, you get to enjoy the spoils of victory, a grand feast, a long table in a torchlit hall, groaning under the weight of roasted swans, suckling pigs, and mountains of fine food, a reward for your valor. That's the image. The reality, for your day-to-day existence, was far less appetizing. The life of a knight wasn't a series of feasts. It was a long, slow grind of monotonous, tasteless, and questionable nutrition. Forget the banquet. Let's talk about the knight's actual working lunch. First, the centerpiece of every meal, bread. But you must erase the image of a soft, fluffy loaf from your mind. That was a luxury for the highest nobility, if it existed at all. Your bread was a tool, a dense, heavy, brick-like object made from coarse flour like rye or barley. It was full of grit from the stone grinders, so every bite was a small act of abrasion against your teeth. It wasn't meant to be delicious. It was meant to be filler, a solid mass of carbohydrates to quiet the rumbling in your stomach. Often, the bread wasn't even served on a plate. The bread was the plate. A thick, stale slice of it was called a trencher. Your food would be ladled onto this slab of bread. It would soak up the juices and grease from whatever else you were eating. At the end of the meal, if you were still hungry, you might eat your plate. But more often, these soggy, flavor-soaked pieces of bread were collected and given as alms to the poor or thrown to the dogs. Your plate was someone else's leftovers. Now, what went on top of that bread? The main course, the daily special, which never changed. It was called pottage, and it was, in essence, a perpetual stew. Imagine a large cauldron, always hanging over a fire. Into this cauldron went everything. Literally, everything. Any vegetables that could be found. Turnips, onions, carrots, grains like barley or oats to thicken it. And if you were lucky, some scraps of meat. This stew was never emptied. It was a living thing. Each day, new ingredients were added to whatever was left over from the day before. It would simmer for days, weeks even. The flavor was powerful. A thick, brown, homogeneous sludge where every individual ingredient lost its identity. This wasn't a culinary choice. It was a necessity. The long cooking time and strong flavors were perfect for masking the taste of meat that was just beginning to turn. You didn't question what was in the pottage. You just ate it. It was hot, it was filling, and it was there. Let's talk about the meat. The image of the knight tearing into a roasted leg of mutton is powerful, but fresh meat was a rarity, a treat, after a successful hunt or before a major feast. Most of the meat you ate on campaign was preserved. Heavily salted pork, smoked fish, dried beef that was as tough as leather. It had to be soaked for hours, just to make it chewable. And even then, it was a battle for your jaw. The salt would dry you out, leaving you with a constant, nagging thirst. What did you drink to quench that thirst? Not water. Water was a gamble. A single contaminated stream could cripple an entire army with dysentery. So you drank ale or beer. But again, this wasn't the crisp, refreshing lager you know. Medieval small beer was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol. It was murky, nutritious, and safe to drink because the brewing process killed the bacteria. It wasn't a refreshment. It was a liquid form of bread, a source of calories. You drank it because you had to, not because you wanted to. Wine was for the rich, for the lords, for the clergy. You drank the sludge. So, your daily meal consisted of a brick of gritty bread, a ladleful of eternal brown stew, a piece of salty shoe leather meat, and a mug of thick, warmish ale. There were no fresh fruits, no green salads, no delicate spices from the east, just a monotonous rotation of starch, salt, and questionable protein. It wasn't a diet designed for peak performance. It was a diet designed for bare minimum survival. Scurvy, digestive problems, and chronic malnutrition were your constant dining companions. The feasts did happen, yes, but they were the exception. They were rare moments of political theater. Your reality was the trencher, the pottage, and the endless, gnawing feeling that you were still hungry. The life of a knight wasn't a feast. It was a famine, interrupted by occasional moments of excess. The road to becoming this underfed, foul-smelling, and financially insecure warrior was not a short one. It wasn't a path of glory. It was a long, brutal, and deeply dehumanizing process that began when you were still a child. No one was born a knight. Knighthood was beaten into you, forged in a crucible of servitude, humiliation, and relentless, thankless work. The stories paint it as a noble apprenticeship. The truth is, it was a 14-year-long unpaid internship from hell. It started at the age of 7. At an age when a modern child is learning to read and write, you, a son of a noble family, were sent away. You were taken from your mother, from your home, and delivered to the castle of another lord. You were now a page, and your education was about to begin. But you weren't there to learn philosophy. You were there to learn your place, which was at the bottom. Your life as a page was the life of a servant. You were the lowest ranking member of the noble household. You learned to wait on tables, clearing away the trenchers and greasy bones of the knights you hoped to one day become. You ran errands. You carried messages. You learned to groom horses, to clean stables, to polish another man's boots. You were taught basic manners by the lady of the castle. Yes, how to carve meat, how to pour wine, how to not speak unless spoken to. But your real teachers were the squires and the knights, and their lessons were harsh. You were surrounded by older, stronger boys and men who saw you as a plaything or an outlet for their frustrations. The primary teaching method was physical punishment. A mistake in serving, a moment of hesitation, a dropped cup, all of it would be met with a swift cuff to the head or a lash from a switch. There was no concept of positive reinforcement. There was only fear. Fear of failure, fear of pain, fear of humiliation. It was designed to strip away the softness of childhood, to make you hard, obedient, and invisible. You learned to move silently, to anticipate needs, to never complain. You learned the intricate politics of the household, who to fear, who to flatter, who to avoid. It was a lonely and terrifying existence for a 7-year-old boy. If you survived this first phase, if you didn't run away or get sent home in disgrace, you might be promoted around the age of 14. You were now a squire. The word sounds more impressive. It wasn't. You simply graduated from being a general household servant to being the personal property of a single knight. Your life now had one focus: your master. You were his valet. You woke before him to get him dressed. You were his groom. You were responsible for his war horse, that incredibly valuable and temperamental animal. You fed it. You cleaned it. You protected it with your life, because its life was worth more than yours. You were his armorer. You were responsible for his entire suit of armor. You had to learn the name of every single piece, how they fit together. You had to spend hours every single day cleaning the rust, oiling the joints, and repairing the damage. You were the one who had to deal with the stench we talked about earlier. That was your job, and you were his training partner. You learned to fight, not through gentle instruction, but by being a human punching bag. You would spend hours in the training yard, getting knocked off your feet by your master, learning to endure the pain of a wooden sword smacking against your ribs. You learned to wield a lance, a sword, an axe, not through theory, but through brutal, repetitive practice. Your body became a canvas of bruises and scars. In battle, you were not yet a combatant. You were support staff. You followed your master into the fray, but your job was to stay just behind him. You carried his spare weapons, his spare shield. If his lance shattered, you had to have another one ready. If he was unhorsed, it was your job to rush in, protect him from the foot soldiers, and get him back on his feet or onto a fresh horse. It was an incredibly dangerous job. You had little armor, but you were expected to charge into the heart of the chaos. Many squires died in their first battle, trying to save the man they served. You had no personal life. You slept on the floor at the foot of your master's bed, a human guard dog. You ate his leftovers. You wore the clothes he provided. Your entire existence was an extension of his will for 7 more years, from age 14 to 21, a long, slow, painful erasure of your own identity. And after all that, after 14 years of servitude, pain, and fear, becoming a knight wasn't even a guarantee. It was a gift. If you had served well, if you had proven your courage, and if your lord thought you were ready, and crucially, if he or your family could afford the immense expense of the ceremony and equipment, only then would you be knighted. The ceremony itself was full of pious ritual, a night of prayer, a symbolic bath, the white tunic of purity, but it was all a thin veneer of holiness, painted over a foundation of pure brutality. You weren't knighted because you were pure of heart. You were knighted because you had survived a system designed to break you. You had proven you were hard enough, cruel enough, and obedient enough to join the club. So, you've made it. You survived the brutal childhood. You endured the ceremony. You are now a knight. You have the armor, the horse, the title. You are at the top of the warrior food chain. You must be wealthy, powerful, secure, a man of means. Wrong. For many knights, the moment of their knighting was the peak of their financial solvency. From that day forward, their life would be a desperate, unending struggle against a single, relentless enemy: debt. Being a knight wasn't a noble calling. It was a business, an incredibly expensive, high-risk, and often unprofitable business. Forget the image of the landed lord in his castle, counting his gold. The more accurate image for many is a heavily armed freelancer, perpetually one bad decision away from complete financial ruin. Let's look at the balance sheet. First, the startup costs, the equipment. We've talked about the armor. A full suit of custom-fitted plate armor was not an off-the-rack purchase. It was a masterpiece of high technology, forged by a master craftsman over months. The cost was staggering. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a high-performance luxury car or a small house. A single suit of armor could be worth the entire value of a small village. Then there's the horse. And not just any horse. A knight's war horse, or destrier, was a genetic marvel, a specially bred and trained animal, the size of a small elephant, capable of carrying a fully armored man into battle. They were the tanks of the medieval battlefield, and they were priced accordingly. A prize destrier could cost more than the armor, and you didn't just have one. That would be insane. Your war horse was too valuable and too aggressive for everyday travel, so you also needed a palfrey, a smaller, more comfortable horse for riding on the march. And you needed at least one sumpter, a pack horse, to carry your armor, your tent, and your supplies. You were a one-man cavalry unit. Your stable was a money pit, and these animals were fragile. A misplaced arrow, a broken leg on uneven ground, a sudden illness, and your single greatest investment was gone. But the expenses didn't stop there. You had operating costs. A knight was not a solo operator. He was a small company, and he had a staff. You needed, at minimum, 2 squires. You needed a groom to care for the horses. You might need a page. You often had a few men-at-arms, professional soldiers who fought alongside you. All of these people were your responsibility. You had to feed them. You had to clothe them. You had to pay their wages. Your entourage was a constant drain on your resources. So, the expenses were huge. What about the income? How did you pay for this walking financial crisis? There were a few options. The best case scenario was land. If you were a landed knight, you held a fief from a greater lord. You had a manor, a village, and peasants who worked the land. Their labor and a portion of their crops were your income. But this wasn't as great as it sounds. The income was often fixed, and it was subject to the whims of nature. A bad harvest, a drought, a flood, and your income for the year could be wiped out. But the bills for your armor and horses still had to be paid. So you needed a more direct source of cash. That source was war. War was not just a matter of honor or duty. For a knight, it was a business opportunity. The primary way you made money in a war was not from a salary, it was from plunder. When a city was sacked, you got a share of the loot, and even more importantly, it was from ransom. This is the dirty secret behind all the talk of mercy and honor. In battle, you did not want to kill an enemy knight. Killing him was a waste of a valuable asset. You wanted to capture him. You would knock him off his horse, surround him, and force him to surrender. An enemy knight was a walking bag of gold. After the battle, you would negotiate his ransom with his family. The richer the knight, the higher the ransom. A great duke or earl could be worth a king's fortune. This is why knights had heraldry, why they wore their coats of arms. It wasn't just for show. It was a price tag. It announced to the enemy exactly how much you were worth alive. Tournaments were another option. They were a chance to win glory. Yes, but also prize money, or even the horse and armor of your defeated opponent. But it was a high-stakes gamble. You could just as easily be the one to lose your priceless horse and armor, pushing you even deeper into debt. The result of this precarious financial situation was that many knights lived a life of constant anxiety. They were forced to take loans from merchants and moneylenders, often at ruinous interest rates. Many became what were known as bachelor knights or freelances, knights without land, who were essentially mercenaries. They would travel from conflict to conflict, selling their sword and their loyalty to whichever lord or king was paying. The romantic notion of undying loyalty to a single cause was a luxury that many knights simply could not afford. Their primary loyalty was to their creditors. They weren't just warriors. They were heavily armed entrepreneurs in a violent and unpredictable market. So, the knight was not the pure, selfless warrior of legend. He was a man trapped in a heavy, stinking shell. He was a product of a brutal and abusive childhood, and he was very often broke. But what about his code? What about chivalry, that unshakable moral compass that guided his every action? The vow to protect the weak, to uphold justice, to speak the truth. Surely that was real. Surely that was the one part of the legend that held true. It wasn't. Chivalry, as you imagine it, was perhaps the greatest myth of them all. It was not a binding code of conduct that every knight followed. It was a literary ideal, a set of romantic, high-minded principles created by poets and priests to try and civilize a brutal warrior class. It was a beautiful fiction, a marketing campaign for the aristocracy, and like most marketing, the product rarely lived up to the advertisement. The first and most important thing to understand about chivalry is that it was entirely class-based. It was a set of rules for how nobles should treat other nobles. It was a professional courtesy among members of the same exclusive club to a fellow knight. You might be expected to show a degree of honor. You might offer him a fair fight. If you defeated him, you were expected to show mercy. But this mercy wasn't born from a gentle heart. It was born from the business of ransom we just discussed. A living, captured knight was profitable. A dead one was not. Chivalry was, in many ways, just a set of rules for good business. But what about the weak? The peasants, the common folk, the innocent villagers? The code said you were supposed to protect them. The reality was the opposite. Chivalry did not apply to the lower classes. A peasant was not considered your equal. He was your property. He was a resource. And in war, knights were often unspeakably brutal to the very people they were sworn to protect. When an army marched through enemy territory, it lived off the land. This was a polite term for widespread theft and destruction. Knights and their men would raid villages, steal food and livestock, and burn what they couldn't carry. This wasn't seen as a violation of chivalry. It was standard military strategy, and it was often accompanied by horrific violence against the civilian population. Slaughtering unarmed men, women, and children was not uncommon. It was a way to terrorize the enemy, to break their will to fight. The chivalrous knight who showed mercy to his noble foe in the morning might spend the afternoon burning a peasant village to the ground without seeing any contradiction in his actions. The code was also a product of the church. The church was deeply uncomfortable with the violent, chaotic nature of the warrior nobility. They invented the concept of the Christian knight to try and channel that violence in directions they approved of. They added ideals like piety, defending the faith, and protecting the church to the mix. The Crusades were the ultimate expression of this idea, turning the knights of Europe from fighting each other to fighting a holy war against an external enemy. But even there, the ideals quickly fell apart. The Crusades were notorious for their massacres of civilians, their political backstabbing, and their naked greed. The chivalric ideal rarely survived contact with reality. The version of chivalry that we know today, the one that involves flowery language, courtly love, and quests for the Holy Grail, is almost entirely a literary invention. It came from the troubadours, the poets who entertained the courts of France and England. They wrote epic poems and romances that presented an idealized, sanitized version of the knightly world. It was a form of escapism for the nobility themselves. It allowed them to see themselves not as the brutal landlords and violent soldiers they often were, but as the romantic heroes of a grand story They weren't describing the world as it was. They were creating a fantasy world that made them feel better about their own power and privilege. The code itself was a tangled mess of impossible contradictions. A knight was sworn to be merciful, but his entire profession was based on extreme violence. He was sworn to be humble, but his entire class was based on arrogance and pride. He was sworn to uphold justice, but his primary loyalty was to his lord, who might be a tyrant. In the end, a knight's actions were not guided by a mystical code of honor. They were guided by a much simpler and more reliable set of principles: loyalty to the man who paid him, the pursuit of personal wealth and glory, and basic, brutal survival. Chivalry was the beautiful story they told themselves afterwards. It was the elegant tapestry they hung on the wall to cover up the bloodstains. It was not a guide for living. It was an alibi. So chivalry was a flexible concept, a beautiful lie that applied only to those in the same tax bracket. It was a gentleman's agreement in a business conducted with sharpened steel. To your fellow knight, you offered a certain professional respect. To the peasant farmer whose field you were trampling, you offered nothing. He was part of the landscape, scenery, and scenery doesn't have rights. This brings us to one of the most persistent and misleading parts of the knightly myth: the idea that the knight was a protector of the common man, the noble warrior standing between the helpless villagers and the forces of chaos. The reality was that for most peasants, the knight was not the solution. The knight was the problem. He was the force of chaos. To understand this, you have to understand the very structure of medieval society. It was a pyramid. At the very bottom, forming the vast base of everything, was the peasantry. Above them were the knights. Above the knights, the great lords and barons, and at the very top, the king. This system was called feudalism, and it was not a system of protection. It was a system of extraction. The knight's entire lifestyle, the armor, the horses, the squires, it all had to be paid for, and it was paid for by the labor of the peasants who lived on his land. A peasant did not own his farm. He was a serf. He was tied to the land, and in a very real sense, he was owned by the lord of the manor, which was often the local knight. Your life as a peasant was a life of unending work for someone else's benefit. You were required to work a certain number of days a week on the knight's own fields, the demesne, for free. This was your rent. You also had to pay a portion of whatever you grew on your own small plot of land to the knight. You had to pay fees to use his mill, to grind your grain, to use his oven to bake your bread. You had to pay a tax when your daughter got married or when your son inherited your meager belongings. The system was designed to siphon every last drop of surplus value from your labor and channel it upwards into the knight's pocket so he could afford that new warhorse. This was not a gentle or voluntary arrangement. It was enforced by the threat of violence, and the knight was the enforcer. He was the landlord, the police, and the judiciary, all rolled into one heavily armed package. If you refused to work, if you couldn't pay your taxes, you wouldn't get an eviction notice. You would get a visit from the knight or his men, and that visit would involve beatings, the seizure of your property, and possibly your death. The relationship between knight and peasant was not one of noble protector and grateful subject. It was one of predator and prey. The knight saw the peasantry as a resource to be exploited, a source of income to fund his real business, which was war, and they were a resource he held in utter contempt. You can see this contempt in the language of the time. The nobility referred to the peasants with derogatory terms. They were seen as dirty, stupid, subhuman animals who existed only to work and serve their betters. The idea that a knight would risk his life to save a peasant was, to the medieval mind, absurd. It would be like a farmer risking his life to save a single stalk of wheat. In times of war, this relationship became even more brutal. Your local knight, your lord, was supposed to protect you in his castle when an enemy army approached. But often, there wasn't enough room or enough food. You and your family would be left outside the walls to fend for yourselves. The invading army, led by other knights, would then descend upon you. They would steal your food, burn your home, and slaughter your family. This was not a war crime. This was just war. And who was committing these atrocities? Knights, the very same class of people who were supposed to be the protectors of the weak. The chivalric code had nothing to say about this, because, in their world, peasants didn't count. They were the silent, suffering majority, whose labor and lives fueled the violent games of the aristocracy. The peasant rebellions that occasionally erupted across medieval Europe were not born from a desire for political freedom. They were born from sheer desperation. They were the screams of a people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. And when these rebellions happened, the knights of all factions, who might have been fighting each other just weeks before, would often unite with terrifying speed and ferocity to crush them. Because on one thing they could all agree: the pyramid must be preserved. The base must be kept in its place. So the next time you see a painting of a knight in shining armor, remember the invisible man standing behind him, the serf, the man whose sweat paid for the steel, whose grain fed the war horse, and whose suffering was the silent, unacknowledged foundation of the entire chivalric myth. The knight was not his hero. He was his cage. But the myth of chivalry wasn't just about protecting the weak. It was also about romance. The knight kneeling before a beautiful lady, pledging his undying love and service, fighting in her name, wearing her colors, dedicating his every victory to her. This is the world of courtly love, a world of pure hearts, noble quests, and chaste devotion. It is also a world that never existed outside of a storybook. Courtly love was a literary and social phenomenon that emerged in the high medieval courts, particularly in southern France. It was a game, a sophisticated, elaborate, and sometimes dangerous game played by the nobility. But it was not about real love, and it was certainly not about marriage. In fact, the entire concept was built on the idea of loving someone you could not marry. Let's be very clear about marriage in the noble class. It was not about love. It was a business transaction, a strategic alliance between two families. A marriage was about consolidating land, securing political power, and producing a male heir. Noble girls were pawns in this game. They were married off at a young age, often to men they had never met, sometimes to men who were decades older than them. Their feelings on the matter were completely irrelevant. Love had nothing to do with it. So, you have a society where marriage is a loveless political contract. This created a social and emotional vacuum. Courtly love was the fantasy that filled that vacuum. It was a set of rules for an elaborate, ritualized form of flirtation. The game worked like this. A young, often unmarried knight would choose a noble lady, almost always married and of a higher social standing, as the object of his devotion. He would write her poems. He would sing her songs. He would sigh dramatically. Whenever she entered a room, he would pledge to be her loyal servant. He would go to tournaments and fight in her honor, wearing a scarf or a glove she had given him as a token. But this was all a performance, a public declaration of a secret, unattainable love. It was meant to be admired by the rest of the court. It showed that the knight was sensitive, cultured, and capable of deep feeling. It showed that the lady was so beautiful and virtuous that she could inspire such devotion. It was a way for knights to practice the arts of conversation and etiquette, and for ladies to exercise a degree of social power in a world where they had very little real power. Was it all just a game? Mostly. The key to courtly love was that it was supposed to be unfulfilled. The love was meant to be spiritual and ennobling, not physical. The whole point was the longing, the yearning, the suffering for a love that could never be. It was meant to inspire the knight to greater deeds of valor, to make him a better man, a better warrior. But people are people, and sometimes the game became real. An affair between a knight and his chosen lady was not unheard of, but this was incredibly dangerous. It was a violation of the rules. Adultery was not just a sin. In the noble class, it was a crime against property and inheritance. A wife's primary duty was to produce a legitimate heir for her husband. An affair called the legitimacy of that heir into question. It threatened the entire foundation of the family's power. If an affair was discovered, the consequences were brutal. The knight could be imprisoned, castrated, or executed. The lady could be repudiated by her husband, locked away in a convent for the rest of her life, or even put to death. The romantic stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, were not seen as romantic tales by a medieval audience. They were seen as tragedies, stories about how forbidden love could bring down kingdoms. So the idea of a knight fighting for the love of a lady was true, but only in a very theatrical sense. He was fighting for his own reputation, to show off his skill and his cultured sensibilities. He was not fighting for her heart. He was playing a role in a courtly drama. The real business of his life, his marriage, was decided in a cold, hard negotiation between his father and another lord. The ladies themselves were not the powerful figures that the poems made them out to be. They were objects of a fantasy. They were symbols. Their role in the game of courtly love was largely passive. They were there to be admired, to inspire, and to reward the knight with a token or a kind word, but they were still trapped in the same system of political marriage as everyone else. The romantic knight, the warrior poet, the selfless lover. He was a character in a story, a fiction created to pass the time in drafty castles, and to add a touch of elegance to a world that was, in reality, governed by land, bloodlines, and cold, hard cash. The love was the performance. The marriage contract was the reality. So, if the knight wasn't a noble protector, and he wasn't a romantic hero, then what was he? He was a soldier, a specialist in a very specific type of violence. But even here, the popular image is a distortion. The tournament, the grand spectacle of knightly combat, was not the friendly sport we see in movies. It was a deadly, chaotic, and often fatal business. The tournament was not a game. It was a war simulation. It was the medieval equivalent of a full-contact military training exercise, and it served several purposes. First and foremost, it was practice. In an era of relative peace, a knight's skills could get rusty. The tournament was a way to keep his combat instincts sharp, to practice maneuvering a warhorse in the chaos of a charge, and to test the limits of his armor and his own endurance. Second, it was a social event, a massive gathering of the nobility from across the region. It was a chance to see and be seen, to forge political alliances, to show off your wealth and your prowess. A great tournament was like a combination of the Olympics, a trade show, and a high society party. And third, it was a business. A successful tournament night could become incredibly wealthy. The prizes were often huge sums of money, but the real money was in the ransom. The rules of a tournament often mirrored the rules of war. If you unhorsed and defeated another knight, You were entitled to his horse and armor. These were, as we've discussed, fantastically expensive. The defeated knight would then have to buy them back from you at a negotiated price. A single good day at a tournament could set a knight up for life. A single bad day could bankrupt him. But we must erase the modern image of two knights in shining armor, galloping towards each other with blunted lances in a perfectly organized joust. That was a later, more civilized version of the tournament. The early tournaments in the 11th and 12th centuries were much more brutal. They were called the melee. The melee was not a series of one-on-one duels. It was a team sport. Two large groups of knights would line up at opposite ends of a huge designated field, which could be miles long. At a signal, they would simply charge at each other. It was a full-scale cavalry battle. There were few rules. You could use swords, axes, maces. The goal was not to score points. The goal was to capture as many enemy knights as possible for ransom. The chaos and violence were indescribable. It was a tangled mass of screaming men and terrified horses, of shattering lances and the percussive clang of steel on steel. Knights were trampled to death. They suffocated in the mud after falling from their horses. They were bludgeoned senseless. Skulls were fractured, bones were broken, and deaths were common. So common, in fact, that the church repeatedly tried to ban tournaments, calling them a sinful waste of Christian lives. But they were too popular and too profitable to stop. The joust, the one-on-one contest with lances, did exist, but it was often just one part of the larger event, and even here, the danger was extreme. The lances were not always blunted. A direct hit from a sharpened lance could punch straight through a shield and a breastplate, impaling the rider. Even with a blunted lance, the impact was ferocious. The goal was to shatter your lance on your opponent's shield or helmet, and ideally, to knock him clean out of his saddle. Being thrown from a charging horse while wearing 60 pounds of armor is a recipe for catastrophic injury. Broken necks, shattered limbs, and fatal concussions were a constant risk. This wasn't a sport for the faint of heart. It was a brutal spectacle that walked a thin line between training and outright combat. The knights who excelled at it were not just skilled horsemen. They were tough, ruthless, and probably half-mad. They were the professional athletes of their day, and like many professional athletes, their careers were often short and ended in crippling injury. The crowd loved it. For the common folk, a tournament was a rare and thrilling spectacle, a chance to see the warrior class in all its violent glory. But for the men on the field, it was a deadly serious affair. It was a test of their courage, a gamble for their fortune, and very often, a dance with death. The tournament field was not a place of chivalry and fair play. It was a microcosm of the medieval battlefield, violent, chaotic, and driven by the cold, hard logic of money and power. The symbols of this violent world were everywhere, but none were more important, more personal, or more misunderstood than the coat of arms. The vibrant, colorful designs painted on a knight's shield and banner. We see them today as quaint, decorative relics, a kind of medieval family logo. But in their time, they were a deadly serious matter of life and death. They were a language, a visual code that every warrior had to be able to read instantly in the heat of battle. To understand why heraldry was so important, you have to imagine the reality of a medieval battlefield. It was not an organized affair with clear battle lines. It was a confusing, terrifying, and noisy mess. It was a sea of mud, blood, and screaming men. And almost every knight on that field was encased in a near-identical suit of steel. From a distance, you could not tell friend from foe. Everyone was an anonymous, metal-clad figure. The helmet, in particular, made identification impossible. Once a knight lowered his visor, his face was gone. He was just another faceless warrior. This created a huge problem of command and control. How does a commander recognize his own men? How does a knight recognize his lord's banner and rally to it? And perhaps most importantly, how do you know who you are fighting? This is where heraldry came in. The coat of arms was, in its simplest form, a giant name tag, a system of identification for the illiterate. The designs had to be simple, bold, and instantly recognizable from a distance. Bright, primary colors were used: red, blue, green, black, yellow, representing gold, and white, representing silver. The patterns were geometric and clear: stripes, checks, crosses. The symbols, or charges, were stylized and easy to distinguish: a lion, an eagle, a simple flower. There was no room for subtle shading or intricate detail. This was not art for a gallery. This was information for a battlefield. A knight would have his coat of arms painted on his shield, embroidered on the surcoat he wore over his armor, and flown on the banner or pennon of his lance. His warhorse might wear a trapper with the same design. His entire presence on the battlefield became a declaration: this is who I am. This system was vital for several reasons. First, for command. A duke or a king could look out over the chaos and, by identifying the banners of his knights, get a rough sense of where his forces were and how the battle was going. Knights learned to recognize the arms of their allies and their enemies. Second, for reputation. A knight's coat of arms was inextricably linked to his personal honor and his family's legacy. The deeds he performed in battle, both good and bad, were associated with that symbol. A famous and feared knight's arms would be instantly recognized, striking fear into his opponents. And third, and this cannot be overstated, for business, the business of ransom. As we've discussed, capturing an enemy knight was far more profitable than killing him. But in the chaos of a melee, how do you know if the man you are about to kill is a poor, landless knight or a wealthy duke worth a fortune? You look at his shield. The coat of arms was a visual price list. A well-known coat of arms belonging to a rich and powerful family was an invitation to capture, not to kill. Men would actively seek out knights bearing the most valuable arms, hoping to secure a life-changing ransom. Conversely, a knight with a minor or unknown coat of arms was more likely to be killed outright, as he was not considered worth the trouble of taking prisoner. Your survival on the battlefield could literally depend on how well known and wealthy your family's logo was. This is why the rules of heraldry became so strict. A coat of arms was a piece of personal property, as valuable as a name or a title. You could not simply invent one. It had to be granted or inherited. No two knights in the same kingdom could have the same coat of arms. This led to the creation of heralds, official experts whose job it was to keep track of all the arms, to recognize them on the battlefield, and to act as official messengers and diplomats. They were the walking, talking databases of the medieval warrior class. So the coat of arms was not a decoration. It was a vital piece of military technology. It was a solution to the fundamental problem of identification in the age of anonymous armored warfare. It was a language of symbols that communicated identity, status, and value in a world where a single glance could be the difference between a glorious payday and a quick, anonymous death in the mud. So the knight was a walking, talking billboard for his own net worth. His shield was his price tag. His survival depended on being recognized as a valuable asset. This required a certain kind of intelligence, of visual literacy, the ability to read the complex language of heraldry in a split second. But there was another kind of literacy that was almost entirely absent from the knightly world, the ability to read and write actual words. The image of the warrior poet, the knight who could compose a sonnet to his lady before charging into battle, is a powerful one. It is also almost entirely false. The overwhelming majority of medieval knights were illiterate, completely and unapologetically illiterate. And it wasn't seen as a failing, it was seen as normal. For their class, reading and writing were not just unnecessary skills, they were someone else's job. To understand this, you have to throw away your modern assumptions about education. Today, we see literacy as a fundamental skill, a gateway to knowledge, and a basic requirement for a successful life. In the Middle Ages, society was structured differently. It was divided into three broad categories: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. The clergy prayed. The nobility fought, the peasants worked, and each group had its own distinct skill set. The clergy, the monks, and the priests were the intellectuals. They were the record keepers. The scholars, the librarians. Their world was the world of the book. They spent their lives copying manuscripts, studying theology, and preserving the written knowledge of the ancient world, reading and writing in Latin. The language of the church and of scholarship was the core of their profession. They were the specialists in the written word. The peasants, of course, were almost universally illiterate. They had no need for it. Their lives were governed by the seasons, by the spoken word of their lord, and by the traditions passed down through generations. Their knowledge was practical, not textual. And then there were the knights, the fighters. Their education, as we've seen, was entirely physical. From the age of 7, their training was focused on one thing: the art of war. They learned to ride a horse, to wield a sword, to handle a lance. They learned to hunt, to hawk, to understand the brutal etiquette of the battlefield. Their bodies were their primary tool, and their classroom was the training yard. In this world, a book was a useless, delicate object. It couldn't stop a blow from a mace. It couldn't unhorse an opponent. Reading and writing were seen as clerical work, the work of clerks. It was a soft indoor activity associated with the monastery, not the battlefield. For a knight to spend his time learning to decipher manuscripts would have been seen as strange, even unmanly. It was a distraction from his real duties. Why would a man destined to lead a cavalry charge need to know how to form his letters? That's what he paid a priest for. A great lord, or a king, would have a household full of literate clerks and clergy to handle his affairs. They would read his letters to him. They would write his replies. They would manage his accounts and his legal documents. The Lord himself would simply listen, make a decision, and then apply his seal to the document to make it official. The seal, a wax impression of his coat of arms, was his signature. It was a visual confirmation of his authority in a world where a written signature would have been meaningless for most of his peers. This is not to say that no knights could read. There were exceptions, of course, particularly in the later Middle Ages. As society became more complex and the nature of warfare began to change, some knights, especially those from very powerful and wealthy families with close ties to the royal court, might have received a more rounded education, but they were the rare exception, not the rule. For the average land-holding knight of the 11th, 12th, or 13th century, literacy was an alien skill. This had profound consequences. It meant that their understanding of the world was shaped entirely by the spoken word, by songs, poems, and stories recited by minstrels in the great hall, by sermons delivered by the local priest. Their knowledge of history, of religion, of their own family's legacy was all received orally. This is why the epic poems and romances were so important. They were the primary form of entertainment and cultural transmission for the warrior class. The knights didn't read about Charlemagne or King Arthur. They listened to stories about them. It also meant that they were completely dependent on the clergy to interpret the written world for them. A knight had to trust that the priest reading a letter to him was reading it accurately. He had to trust that the clerk drawing up a contract was writing what he had been told to write. This placed an enormous amount of power in the hands of the literate few. So the next time you picture a knight, do not picture a man of letters. Picture a man whose mind was a repository of oral tradition, whose signature was a stamp of wax, and whose relationship with the written word was one of distant and slightly suspicious dependence. He was not a scholar. He was a weapon. And in his world, the sword was, quite literally, mightier than the pen, because for him, the pen was a tool he did not know how to use. The one tool a knight did know how to use, the one object that was an extension of his own body, was his sword, the knightly sword, the long sword, the arming sword. It is perhaps the most romanticized weapon in human history, a symbol of justice, of power, of the righteous warrior. It was a beautiful object, often intricately decorated, perfectly balanced, the product of a master craftsman's highest art. It was also a brutally efficient tool for killing, and its value, both monetary and symbolic, was immense. Let's talk about what a sword was actually worth. This is not a simple question, but we can make some comparisons. A basic, unadorned sword for a common man-at-arms might be relatively affordable, but we are talking about the sword of a knight, a weapon that he trusted with his life. This was not a mass-produced item. It was a piece of high-end, custom technology. The blade itself was the product of a near-magical process. Steel had to be forged, folded, and hammered repeatedly to remove impurities and create a blade that was both hard enough to hold a razor edge and flexible enough to absorb the shock of impact without shattering. This was a secret, specialized knowledge held by a few master smiths. The techniques for creating high-quality steel, like Damascus steel with its distinctive watery patterns, were closely guarded secrets. The hilt, the crossguard, the pommel, these were not just functional parts. They were expressions of the owner's status. They could be inlaid with silver or gold, wrapped in fine leather, and decorated with precious stones or enamel work. The pommel wasn't just for balance. It could be a hollow reliquary containing a tiny fragment of a saint's bone, a holy relic to protect the owner in battle. So what was the price tag on this piece of lethal art? It varied wildly. But we have some records. In the 14th century, a high-quality sword could cost as much as a small farm. It could be worth more than a peasant would earn in his entire lifetime. A conservative modern equivalent would be the price of a luxury car. A truly exceptional sword, one made by a famous smith and owned by a great king, would be priceless. It would be a national treasure. This incredible expense tells you a lot about the knight's world. First, it reinforces the idea that knighthood was a profession for the rich. The barrier to entry was enormous. Second, it tells you how important the sword was. It was likely the single most expensive personal item a knight owned, apart from his armor and his horse. It was an investment, an heirloom, passed down from father to son for generations. To lose your sword in battle was not just a disgrace, it was a catastrophic financial loss. The sword was also a powerful symbol. It was the physical representation of the knight's identity. The ceremony of knighting was called an accolade, and it centered around the dubbing, the moment when the lord would tap the new knight on the shoulder with a sword. The sword was a symbol of justice, which is why we still see it in the scales of justice today. Oaths were sworn on a sword, with the cross guard forming a Christian cross. To surrender, you offered your sword to your conqueror, hilt first. It was a gesture of complete submission. But we must not forget its primary purpose. It was not a symbol. It was a weapon. The arming sword, the typical one-handed knightly sword, was a versatile tool. It was a cutting weapon, designed to shear through unarmored flesh and light armor like mail. But it was also a thrusting weapon, with a tapering point designed to be driven into the gaps of plate armor. The pommel itself could be used as a blunt instrument, a makeshift hammer, to smash an opponent's face in the close quarters desperation of a grapple. The medieval fighting manuals, the Fecht Bücher, show us that swordsmanship was a complex and sophisticated martial art. It was not the clumsy hacking and bashing we see in movies. It was a science of angles, timing, and leverage. Knights trained relentlessly in its use. And yet, for all its importance, the sword was not the knight's primary weapon on the battlefield. That was the lance. The sword was a sidearm, a backup weapon, for when the charge was over and you were on foot in the grim, close quarters reality of the melee. But it was the weapon that defined him. It was the one object that was both a tool of his trade and the very soul of his identity. It was his badge of office, his key to salvation, and a piece of exquisite deadly art that was worth a fortune. The sword was the knight's most intimate weapon, his constant companion, but his true power, the source of his dominance on the battlefield for centuries, was not in his hand. It was beneath him. The knight was nothing without his horse, specifically his war horse, the destrier. This was not just an animal. It was a living weapon, a four-legged engine of destruction that transformed a single armored man into a terrifying force of shock and awe. And it was the knight's greatest and most vulnerable asset. Let's be clear. The destrier was not the kind of horse you see in a riding school. It was a creature bred and trained for a single terrifying purpose, the cavalry charge. They were enormous, often standing over 16 hands high and built like a modern draft horse, but with the speed and aggression of a predator. They were stallions, chosen for their natural aggression and strength. They were not gentle creatures. They were notoriously difficult to handle, violent, and utterly fearless. Their training was as long and as brutal as the knight's own. From a young age, they were conditioned to ignore the noise and chaos of battle. They were trained to respond to the rider's leg pressure and weight shifts, as the knight's hands would be busy with a lance and shield. And they were trained to fight. A war horse was taught to bite, to kick, and to trample men on the ground. It was an active participant in the violence. The power of a knight on a destrier was a matter of simple physics. A 200-pound man, wearing 60 pounds of armor, riding a 500-pound horse, charging at 20 miles per hour, with a 12-foot wooden lance couched under his arm. The kinetic energy at the point of that lance was immense. It was a human-guided missile. A formation of knights, charging in a wedge, could shatter a line of unarmored infantry, like a bowling ball hitting pins. For centuries, this was the decisive tactic on the European battlefield, the charge of the heavy horse. But this power came at an incredible price. A destrier was an object of immense value, often costing more than a knight's full suit of armor. They were rare. Breeding them was a specialized art, and a single prize stallion could be the foundation of a lord's military power. This made the warhorse a massive investment and a massive liability. First, there was the upkeep. A destrier ate a huge amount of high-quality food, like oats, not just grass. It required constant grooming and care from a dedicated groom. It needed special shoes, a specialized saddle, and often its own suit of armor, called a barding. The logistical tail required to keep a force of heavy cavalry in the field was enormous. Second, they were specialists. A destrier was a weapon of war, not a mode of transport. They were too aggressive and too valuable to be ridden on the long, slow march to a campaign. For that, a knight had a smaller, more comfortable horse, a palfrey. The destrier would be led by a squire, kept fresh and ready for the moment of battle. This meant a knight needed a stable of expensive, specialized animals. But the greatest liability was their vulnerability in battle. For all its power, a horse is still a living creature. It's a huge, unarmored target. An infantryman with a long spear, a well-placed arrow from a long bow, or a simple hole dug in the ground could bring a charging horse down in an instant. And once the horse went down, the knight's world collapsed. He would be thrown to the ground, trapped in his heavy armor. His greatest weapon was gone, and he was now at a huge disadvantage. His mobility was gone. He was just a slow, heavy infantryman, vulnerable to being surrounded and pulled down by common soldiers. This is why a key tactic for any army facing heavy cavalry was to target the horses, not the knights. Kill the horse, and you neutralize the knight. An army of archers could unleash a storm of arrows, not at the armored men, but at the soft, unprotected chests and legs of their mounts. A line of pikemen would present a forest of sharpened points, aimed not at the rider's shield, but at the horse's throat. The relationship between a knight and his destrier was one of deep, professional dependence. There was a bond, yes, but it was the bond between a soldier and his weapon. The loss of his war horse in battle was a devastating blow. It was the loss of his mobility, his power, and a huge chunk of his personal fortune. Many a knight was bankrupted and ruined by the loss of a single horse. So the war horse was the knight's greatest strength and his most profound weakness. It was the engine of his power, the symbol of his status, and the fragile living heart of his entire military existence. The thundering charge of the destriers was the sound of medieval warfare, but the scream of a dying horse was the sound of that power breaking apart. So the knight was a complex, contradictory figure, a highly trained, heavily armed, and often indebted specialist in violence. His power was based on the horse, and that power was absolute until it wasn't. For centuries, the battlefield was his kingdom. The cavalry charge was the ultimate argument, a thundering force of nature that could sweep away all opposition. But no military dominance lasts forever. Technology evolves, and a new sound was beginning to be heard on the battlefields of Europe, a sound that would spell the beginning of the end for the age of the knight. It wasn't the clang of steel, it was the quiet, menacing hum of a drawn bowstring. The knightly charge was not invincible. It had weaknesses. It required open, flat ground. It was vulnerable to well-prepared defenses. And it was incredibly vulnerable to a new generation of infantry weapons that could kill from a distance, with devastating power, before the knight even got close. The two weapons that did more than any others to dismantle the myth of knightly invincibility were the longbow and the crossbow. Let's start with the crossbow. The crossbow was, in essence, a mechanical bow mounted on a stock. It was relatively easy to use. An untrained peasant could be taught to load and fire a crossbow with a reasonable degree of accuracy in a matter of days. It did not require immense physical strength. The bow was drawn back using a crank or a lever, and the string was held in place by a mechanical trigger. This meant that an archer could hold a crossbow at full draw indefinitely, waiting for the perfect moment to shoot. And the power was immense. A heavy siege crossbow could fire a short, thick bolt, called a quarrel, with enough force to punch through chainmail and even thin plate armor at close range. A volley of crossbow bolts from a defensive position, like the walls of a castle, could be devastating to an attacking force. The nobility hated the crossbow. They saw it as an unfair, cowardly weapon. It allowed a low-born peasant, a man with no training in the noble arts of war, to kill a knight from a distance without any personal risk or courage. It was an insult to the entire chivalric ideal. The church agreed. The Second Lateran Council, in 1139, actually banned the use of crossbows against Christians, calling it a weapon hateful to God. Of course, this ban was almost universally ignored. The crossbow was simply too effective to give up. But the crossbow had a critical weakness. It was slow, incredibly slow to reload. The process of cranking back the string, placing the bolt, and aiming could take up to a minute. In the heat of a pitched battle, this was a lifetime. A knight on a charging horse could cover a huge amount of ground in the time it took a crossbowman to prepare his second shot. This is where the other weapon came in. The English longbow. In the hands of a master, the longbow was an instrument of terrifying power and speed. It was not a simple weapon. It was a 6-foot stave of yew wood, and it required immense strength, skill, and years of constant practice to use effectively. The draw weight of a medieval warbow was immense, up to 150 pounds or more. Modern archers struggle to draw a bow half that strong. English archers were trained from childhood, developing the powerful back and shoulder muscles needed to handle such a weapon. Skeletons of medieval archers often show telltale signs of this strain: enlarged left arms and deformed fingers. But the result of this training was a human machine gun. A skilled longbowman could fire 10, even 12 arrows a minute. An army of several thousand archers could release a storm of arrows, a cloud so thick it blotted out the sun, as the chroniclers said. And these arrows were deadly. The bodkin point was a long, thin spike of hardened iron, designed not to cut, but to punch through armor. A bodkin arrow fired from a heavy war bow could pierce chainmail with ease. And while it might not be able to punch through the thickest parts of a steel breastplate, it could find the gaps. It could hit the horse. A charging knight presented a huge target, and his horse was almost entirely unprotected. The great battles of the 100 Years' War, like Crécy and Agincourt, were the funerals of the old way of fighting. At Agincourt, in 1415, a small, exhausted English army, composed mostly of longbowmen, faced a massive French army, packed with the flower of French chivalry. The French knights were confident. They were heavily armored, nobles of the highest rank. They faced an army of English commoners. They charged. It was a disaster. The field was a sea of mud after a heavy rain. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, were slow and clumsy. The English longbowmen stood their ground and simply unleashed a torrent of arrows. The sky went black. The arrows fell like rain. They didn't even need to aim for the knights. They aimed for the horses. The horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud, creating a tangled, struggling mass of men and animals. The French charge dissolved into a bloody, chaotic pile-up. The knights, who were unhorsed, trapped in the mud, were helpless. The English archers then dropped their bows, drew daggers and hatchets, and waded into the mess to finish the job, slaughtering the trapped and wounded French nobility by the thousand. Agincourt was a lesson written in blood. A few thousand common soldiers, armed with a simple weapon made of wood, had systematically destroyed the greatest army in Christendom. It proved that discipline, tactics, and superior ranged firepower could defeat the brute force of the aristocratic charge. The age of the knight was not over, but its absolute dominance was the battlefield, was no longer his private playground. He now had to share it with a new kind of soldier, the common man, armed with a weapon that could kill from a distance, a man who didn't know the rules of chivalry and didn't care. The longbow and the crossbow didn't just kill knights. They killed the idea that war was a noble game played only by the rich. They made war what it had always been for the common man, a dirty, impersonal, and efficient business of killing. So, the knight was becoming obsolete, a slow, heavy, and expensive target in a world that was getting faster and deadlier. The common soldier, with his longbow or his pike, was changing the rules of the game. But the knightly ideal, the idea of a brotherhood of elite warriors, bound by a sacred oath and dedicated to a higher purpose, was a powerful one. It didn't just fade away. It evolved. It became organized. It produced one of the most famous and feared institutions of the Middle Ages, the military order, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights. These were not just individual warriors. They were corporations of violence, multinational organizations with a sword in one hand and a prayer book in the other. Let's start with the most famous of them all, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. Their story begins in the Holy Land. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem, but the roads leading to the Holy City were dangerous. Pilgrims were routinely robbed and killed by bandits. Around 1119, a small group of French knights, led by a man named Hugues de Payens, took a vow. They swore to protect these pilgrims. They were given headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, and so they became the Templars. At first, they were a small, poor, and unremarkable group, but they had a powerful idea. They combined the two most powerful identities of the age, the monk and the knight. A Templar was both. He took the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. He lived a sparse, disciplined life of prayer and contemplation, but he was also a fully trained, heavily armed knight. His monastery was a battlefield. His prayers were answered with the edge of a sword. This was a revolutionary concept, and it was a brilliant piece of branding. The church loved it. A famous cleric, Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote a treatise in their praise, calling them the new knighthood, a perfect fusion of the spiritual and the martial life. Donations began to pour in. Young noblemen, looking for a cause greater than petty feudal warfare, flocked to join their ranks. The order grew. With incredible speed, they became the elite special forces of the Crusader states. They were the most disciplined, the best equipped, and the most fanatically brave soldiers in the Holy Land. In a world of feudal armies, where knights were often arrogant individualists fighting for personal glory, the Templars were a professional fighting unit. They fought as a team, under a strict chain of command. Their famous black and white banner, the beau seant, was a symbol of their ferocity. In battle, they were forbidden from retreating unless the odds were more than 3-1. They were often the first to charge and the last to leave the field. They were, in short, terrifyingly effective. But their story is not just one of military prowess. The Templars were also brilliant innovators in a completely different field, finance. Think about the problem. You are a nobleman in England Who wants to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem? It's a long, dangerous, and incredibly expensive journey. You can't carry a huge amount of gold with you. You'd be a magnet for every thief from Paris to Palestine. The Templars came up with a solution. They created a system that was, in essence, the world's first international banking network. You could go to the Templar Preceptory in London, deposit your gold, and receive a letter of credit, a coded piece of parchment. You would then travel to the Holy Land with only this letter. When you arrived in Jerusalem, you would go to the Templar headquarters, present your letter, and withdraw the equivalent amount in local currency. It was safe, it was efficient, and it was revolutionary. This system made the Templars incredibly wealthy. They became the bankers to popes and kings. They owned huge tracts of land across Europe. They ran farms, vineyards, and mills. They had their own fleet of ships. They were not just a military order. They were a massive, multinational corporation with immense economic and political power. They were too big, too rich, and too independent, and that would be their downfall. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states were gone. The Holy Land was lost. The Templars had lost their original purpose. They were a massive military organization with no war to fight, and they were still fantastically wealthy. This made them a target. King Philip IV of France, a man who was deeply in debt to the Templar Order, saw an opportunity. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip unleashed his plan. In a coordinated, pre-dawn raid across France, every Templar in the kingdom was arrested. The charges were shocking: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry. They were accused of spitting on the cross, of worshipping a severed head called Baphomet, of institutionalized sodomy. What followed was a brutal show trial. The arrested Templars were systematically tortured by the Inquisition under unimaginable pain. Many confessed to the fabricated charges. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, confessed, then recanted, and was burned at the stake in Paris. The Pope, under pressure from the French king, officially disbanded the order. Their vast wealth was seized. It was one of the most cynical and brutal corporate takeovers in history. Were the charges true? Almost certainly not. They were a convenient excuse for a bankrupt king to eliminate his creditors and seize their assets. The story of the Templars is a cautionary tale. It's a story of how a small group of pious warriors became a powerful global institution, and how that very power, that wealth and influence, made them so dangerous that the world they were created to protect ultimately turned on them and destroyed them. They were not just knights. They were a corporation, and they were liquidated. The battlefield was a place of chaos and violence, but it was also a marketplace, a brutal, high-stakes economy where the primary commodity was human life. We've talked about the immense cost of being a knight, but in the twisted logic of medieval warfare, there was a way to make that cost pay dividends, and it wasn't through plunder or land or glory. It was through a system that turned your most dangerous enemy into your most valuable asset: the system of ransom. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of knightly combat. We have an image of knights fighting to the death for honor and glory. The reality was much more pragmatic. For a knight, killing another knight was often a terrible business decision. It was a waste of a perfectly good revenue stream. The goal of combat between nobles was not necessarily to kill. It was to incapacitate, to disarm, and to capture, because a living, captured knight was worth a fortune. The entire system was built on the class distinctions of the time. It was a perk of nobility. If you were a common foot soldier, a peasant archer, or a pikeman, this system did not apply to you. If you were captured in battle, you were a liability. You had no money for ransom. You were difficult to feed and guard, so you were usually just killed. A quick knife to the throat after the fighting was over. The no quarter rule, often applied to the common soldier. But if you were a knight, your life had a price tag, a very specific price tag. Your capture was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery for the man who took you prisoner. The process began on the battlefield itself. Once a knight was unhorsed or cornered, he would signal his surrender. He would often do this by handing over his sword or his gauntlet. At this point, under the informal laws of war, he became a prisoner. He was now out of the fight. His captor would usually take his parole, his word of honor that he would not try to escape, and would often let him go back to his own camp with an agreement to meet after the battle to negotiate the terms of his release. This seems insane to us, but the code of honor, when it came to money, was surprisingly effective. To break your parole was a profound disgrace that would ruin your reputation among your peers. After the battle, the negotiations would begin. The ransom was not a fixed price. It was based on the captured knight's wealth, his land, and his social standing. A minor, landless knight might be worth a relatively small sum. A great baron or an earl could be worth a king's ransom. Literally, the ransom of King Richard the Lionheart, who was captured on his way back from the Third Crusade, was so enormous that it nearly bankrupted the entire kingdom of England to pay it. The money was paid by the prisoner's family or his lord. This could take months, even years to raise. It might require selling off land, taking on massive loans, or levying special taxes. While the ransom was being arranged, the captured knight was often treated remarkably well. He was a guest, not a prisoner. He might live in the castle of his captor, eat at his table, go hunting with him. He was, after all, a fellow nobleman and a valuable investment. You don't mistreat your prize-winning racehorse. This system had a profound effect on the nature of warfare. It meant that battles between nobles were often less bloody than we might imagine. Knights were actively trying not to kill each other. They would use blunted weapons or the flat of their swords. They would aim to unhorse an opponent, not to skewer him. The real killing was done among the infantry. It also created a whole class of professional warriors who made their living from the tournament and battlefield. A knight like William Marshall, one of the most famous knights of the 12th century, started as a landless younger son and became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, almost entirely through the profits he made from capturing and ransoming other knights in tournaments. But this system was also a source of great tension. What happened when a common soldier, a man to whom the rules of chivalry did not apply, managed to capture a knight? This was a dilemma. The common soldier had a winning lottery ticket in his hands, but he was not supposed to be playing the game. Usually, he was required to hand the noble prisoner over to his own lord in exchange for a small finder's fee. The lord would then get to keep the massive ransom. As you can imagine, this did not always go smoothly, and the system began to break down in the later Middle Ages. The rise of disciplined infantry armies, armed with longbows and pikes, changed the equation. These men were not interested in taking prisoners for ransom. They were interested in killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. At battles like Agincourt, the English archers did not play by the chivalric rules. They waded into the mud and slaughtered the trapped French nobility. King Henry V even gave a controversial order to kill the French prisoners taken in the battle, for fear that they might rearm themselves and rejoin the fight. This was seen as a shocking breach of the laws of war by the French. To the English, it was just grim military necessity. Ransom was the economic engine of chivalric warfare. It was a system that privatized the profits of war, turning it into a brutal form of aristocratic commerce. It created a strange paradox, a world where your life was safer if you were a wealthy combatant than if you were a poor one. It was a system that incentivized capture over killing, but only for the privileged few. For everyone else, the battlefield remained what it had always been, a place of anonymous, unransomed death. The knightly world was a world of violence, governed by a strange mix of brutal pragmatism and elaborate ritual. But even in this harsh reality, there was a place for myth, for stories, for legends that spoke of a nobler time, a purer form of knighthood, and no legend was more powerful, more enduring, or more central to the knightly ideal than the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Camelot, Excalibur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, the quest for the Holy Grail. These are not just stories. They are foundational myths of Western culture. They represent a perfect, idealized vision of the chivalric world, a world of courage, honor, and fellowship, where noble knights dedicated their lives to a righteous king and a divine quest. It's a beautiful, powerful image. It is also almost entirely a work of fiction. The question that has haunted historians for centuries is this: was there a real King Arthur? The answer is maybe, but if he existed, he was nothing like the character in the stories. Let's travel back in time, not to the high Middle Ages of knights in shining armor, but much further, to the 5th or 6th century. The Dark Ages. Roman Britain has collapsed. The legions have gone home. The island is descending into chaos, a patchwork of warring Celtic kingdoms. And from the east, pagan invaders are coming. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. In this historical fog, we find the first whispers of a figure named Arthur. He is not a king. He is a military leader, a dux bellorum, a duke of battles. Early Welsh sources, like the Historia Brittonum, mention a warrior named Arthur who led the Celtic Britons in a series of 12 battles against the Saxon invaders. The last and greatest of these battles was the Battle of Badon Hill, a decisive victory that supposedly halted the Saxon advance for a generation. This Arthur, if he was real, was a Romano-British commander, a product of the lingering Roman civilization, fighting a desperate rearguard action against the tide of history. He would not have been a knight in shining plate armor. That was a technology that was still centuries in the future. He would have been a late Roman cavalry commander, wearing a mail shirt and a helmet, leading a band of mounted warriors. His castle of Camelot would not have been a grand stone fortress. It would have been a fortified wooden hill fort. His knights were not the chivalrous figures of romance. They were hard, desperate warlords in a dark and violent age. This is the grain of historical truth from which the entire legend grew, a memory passed down through oral tradition by Welsh bards and storytellers of a great hero who fought for Britain in its darkest hour. But the legend, as we know, it was not born in the Welsh hills. It was created, shaped, and massively embellished much later in the 12th and 13th centuries, the High Middle Ages, the age of chivalry. The first great architect of the Arthurian legend was a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around 1136, he wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain. It was presented as a true history, but it was mostly a work of masterful fiction. Geoffrey took the shadowy figure of the warrior Arthur and transformed him into a magnificent medieval king. He gave him a magical sword, a wizard advisor named Merlin, and a kingdom that stretched across Europe. He made Arthur a contemporary figure, a feudal king ruling over knights who behaved just like the knights of Geoffrey's own time. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, designed to give the Norman kings of England a heroic British pedigree. Then came the French poets, like Chrétien de Troyes. They took Geoffrey's king and built a whole world around him. They invented the character of Lancelot. They created the concept of the Round Table, a symbol of fellowship and equality. They introduced the theme of courtly love, with the tragic affair between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. They shifted the focus from Arthur's wars to the personal quests and moral dilemmas of his knights. And finally, they added the most powerful element of all, the quest for the Holy Grail. The Grail was said to be the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper. The quest to find it transformed the Arthurian world from a secular story of war and romance into a profound Christian allegory. The knights were no longer just warriors. They were pilgrims searching for spiritual perfection. So, the Arthur we know is not a single historical figure. He is a composite character, a literary creation assembled over centuries. He has the heart of a 6th century Celtic warrior, the body of a 12th century feudal king, and the soul of a 13th century Christian mystic. He is not history. He is something more powerful. He is a myth that served a very important purpose for the medieval knightly class. The stories of the Round Table created an impossibly high ideal, a perfect model of chivalry that real knights could aspire to, even if they could never reach it. It gave a sense of divine purpose and moral clarity to their violent profession. It told them that their wars were not just about land and money. They could be about justice and faith and the defense of the realm. Camelot was a dream of a perfect world, a perfect brotherhood, a perfect king. And it was a dream that was all the more powerful because the real world of the medieval knight was so often a nightmare of betrayal, debt, and brutal, pointless violence. The story of King Arthur is not a history of what was. It is a story about what they wished they could have been. The Knights of the Round Table were a fellowship of heroes, but their quests were not always about slaying dragons or rescuing damsels. The greatest and most enduring of their quests was a spiritual journey, a search for an object of immense power and mystery, the Holy Grail. This quest is the mystical heart of the Arthurian legend. It's a story of faith, of failure, and of the search for divine grace in a fallen world. But what was the Grail, really? And what did the quest to find it actually mean? The Grail, as the legends tell us, was the cup used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. It was also said to have been used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion as a relic. It was the most sacred object in Christendom. It was said to have miraculous powers. It could provide eternal youth, heal the sick, and even raise the dead. To find it, to even gaze upon it, was to experience a direct connection with God. But the Grail was not just a physical object. It was a symbol of divine grace, of spiritual purity, of a lost connection to heaven that humanity yearned to rediscover. And that is why the quest was so difficult. It was not a treasure hunt. It was a test of the soul. The story of the Grail quest first appears in the French romances of the late 12th century. In these stories, the Grail appears one day in Arthur's court at Camelot. It floats through the hall, veiled in white silk, filling the room with a divine light and a beautiful scent, and providing every knight with his favorite food. Then it vanishes. The knights, awestruck, immediately swear an oath to go on a quest and not return until they have found the Grail and seen it unveiled. This is where the story becomes a profound spiritual allegory. Almost every knight of the Round Table sets out on this quest, but the quest is not a team effort. Each knight must ride out alone. The journey is an individual one. It's a journey into the wilderness, but it's also a journey into the self, and almost every knight fails. The greatest knights of the court, the most famous warriors, fail because they are not spiritually pure enough to achieve the quest. Lancelot, the best knight in the world, the epitome of chivalric virtue, fails. He gets a brief glimpse of the Grail, but he is struck down and blinded because his heart is not pure. He is an adulterer. His love for Queen Guinevere, a mortal sin that bars him from achieving the ultimate spiritual prize. His story is a tragedy, a story of a man who can achieve every worldly success, but who is denied spiritual fulfillment because of the flaws in his own character. The knights who do succeed are not the greatest warriors. They are the purest of heart. Sir Galahad, Lancelot's son, is the perfect knight. He is a virgin, free from sin, a kind of knightly Christ figure. Sir Bors and Sir Percival are also allowed to complete the quest because of their piety and virtue. The message was clear, and it was a radical one for the knightly class. Worldly glory, military prowess, success in tournaments, all of the things that a knight valued were worthless in the eyes of God. True chivalry was not about strength of arms. It was about purity of soul. The Grail quest was a piece of Christian propaganda designed to tell the violent warrior aristocracy that their priorities were wrong. It was an attempt to co-opt the language of knightly adventure and turn it into a lesson about Christian salvation. The quest itself is a series of mystical visions, of symbolic encounters with hermits and angels, of trials that test the knight's faith, not his fighting skill. The challenges are internal. The monsters they must defeat are their own pride, their own lust, their own worldly attachments. In the end, Galahad, Bors, and Percival find the Grail castle. They are allowed to see the Grail unveiled, and they experience a moment of divine ecstasy, a direct union with God. Galahad, having achieved this perfect state of grace, finds the world so lacking in comparison that he prays for death, and his soul is carried up to heaven by angels. The Grail itself is then taken up to heaven, never to be seen on earth again. The quest ends in a kind of holy tragedy. The best knights are dead, or have left the world. The fellowship of the Round Table is broken, shattered by the spiritual trial it has endured. The knights who return to Camelot are humbled and diminished. The quest did not save the kingdom. In a way, it hastened its end by exposing the spiritual emptiness at its core. So what was the Grail? In the stories, it was a cup, but symbolically, it was a mirror that forced the knights to look at their own souls and see their own imperfections. It was a symbol of a perfection that was unattainable for most mortals. The quest was a reminder that the world of Camelot, the world of chivalry, for all its glory, was still a fallen human world, full of sin and failure. The legend of the Holy Grail is not about finding a magical treasure. It's about the search for meaning in a violent and chaotic world. It's about the eternal human struggle between our worldly desires and our spiritual aspirations. And it's a story that tells us that the hardest quests are not the ones that lead to a distant castle, but the ones that lead into the dark and uncharted wilderness of our own hearts. The Templars were a brotherhood, a corporation of holy warriors, but they were not the only game in town. The Crusades spawned a number of these military orders, and one of them, while just as fierce in battle, became famous for a very different kind of work. A work of mercy. A work that began not with a sword, but with a hospital bed. They were the Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights Hospitaller. Their story, like the Templars, begins in Jerusalem, but it begins earlier. Before the First Crusade, a group of Italian merchants founded a hospital in Jerusalem to care for poor and sick pilgrims. It was a charitable act, run by Benedictine monks. When the Crusaders conquered the city, they found this hospital already in operation, a well-respected institution, doing God's work. Many of the Crusaders were so impressed that they gave the hospital huge donations of land and money. The order grew. It became a powerful, independent organization under the direct protection of the Pope. They established a network of hospitals and hospices along the pilgrimage routes across Europe and the Holy Land. Their mission was simple: to care for the sick, the poor, and the wounded. The word hospitality is at the very root of their name. But the Holy Land was a dangerous place. A hospital full of helpless people and accumulated wealth was a tempting target for bandits and enemy raids. So the order adapted. They militarized. They began to accept knights into their ranks, men who would take the same monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but whose primary duty was to defend the hospitals, protect the pilgrims on the roads, and fight alongside the other Crusader armies. And so, the Knights Hospitaller were born, a paradox, an order of monks sworn to care for the sick, who were also some of the most elite and ruthless heavy cavalry in the world. Their black robes, emblazoned with a simple white cross, became as feared on the battlefield as the Templar banner. They were, in many ways, the great rivals of the Templars. They competed for the same donations, for the same recruits, for the same political influence. Their rivalry was often fierce, sometimes even breaking out into open street battles in the cities of the Crusader states. But they were also brothers in arms, often fighting side by side in the great battles against the Saracens. But while the Templars were the bankers, the Hospitallers were the doctors. Their primary mission never changed. The hospitals they ran were legendary. The great hospital in Jerusalem was a marvel of its age, capable of caring for thousands of patients. They employed professional physicians, developed sophisticated medical techniques, and provided a level of care that was unheard of in most of Europe. They were, in essence, running the first international healthcare system. And this dual identity, as both healers and killers, is what makes them so fascinating. A Hospitaller knight might spend his morning in a brutal cavalry charge, cutting down the enemy, and in the afternoon, he might be back in the hospital, gently tending to the wounds of a sick pilgrim, or even a captured enemy soldier. They saw no contradiction in this. To them, it was all part of the same holy work, defending Christendom with the sword, and serving Christ by caring for the sick. This dual focus is also what saved them. When the Crusader states fell, and the Templars lost their purpose and were destroyed, the Hospitallers survived because their mission was not tied only to the Holy Land. There were sick people everywhere, but they did not give up the fight. They were an order of warriors, and they needed a war, so they became a naval power. They moved their headquarters first to Cyprus, and then, in 1309, they conquered the island of Rhodes. For the next 2 centuries, the Knights of Rhodes were a Christian thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire. They were a fortress state, a bastion of naval power, a band of state-sanctioned pirates who preyed on Turkish shipping and defended Europe's sea lanes. They were finally driven from Rhodes in a legendary siege by the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman, the magnificent. But even then, they were not finished. They were given the island of Malta by the Holy Roman Emperor. And from there, as the Knights of Malta, they continued their centuries-long war against the Ottomans, culminating in the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, one of the most brutal and heroic sieges in history. The story of the Hospitallers is a story of adaptation and survival. They began as humble healers. They became warrior monks. They transformed into a sovereign naval power, unlike the Templars, whose incredible wealth and singular focus made them a target. The Hospitallers' more diverse and charitable mission allowed them to endure. They still exist today. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta is a recognized sovereign entity under international law, and it continues its centuries-old mission of humanitarian aid and medical care around the world. They no longer carry swords, but the white cross on a field of red still flies, a symbol of a strange and contradictory history, a history that proves that a brotherhood of knights could be built not just on the business of war, but also on the business of mercy. The knightly world was a man's world, a world of fathers and sons, of brotherhoods and patriarchs. The stories, the laws, the very structure of society were all built by men, for men. A woman's place in this world was prescribed and limited. She was a daughter to be married off, a wife to produce an heir, a lady to be admired from a distance. The idea of a woman putting on armor, picking up a sword, and leading men into battle was not just unusual, it was a violation of the natural order of things. And yet, it happened. The history of the Middle Ages is punctuated by the stories of extraordinary women who defied these expectations. Women who, through a combination of necessity, courage, and sheer force of will, took on the role of the warrior. Were there female knights? In the formal, ceremonial sense, almost certainly not. The institution of knighthood was a male fraternity, but were there women who fought, who led armies, who defended castles? Absolutely. Let's start with the most common scenario, the she-commander. In the feudal world, a castle was the center of power, and when the lord of the castle, the knight or the baron, was away at war, as he so often was, who was left in charge? His wife, the lady of the manor. She was not just expected to run the household, she was expected to be the military commander of the castle's garrison. She was responsible for its defense. If an enemy army appeared at the gates, it was her duty to organize the soldiers, to direct the archers, to manage the food and water supplies, and to conduct the negotiations for surrender or survival. This was not a rare occurrence. The chronicles are full of accounts of noble women leading the defense of their castles in long and brutal sieges. Women like Nicolas de la Haye, who defended Lincoln Castle for King John of England against rebel barons. She was so effective that after the war, the king officially made her the Sheriff of Lincolnshire, an office of immense military and political power. These women were not knights. They did not wear full plate armor and charge into battle on a destrier, but they were military leaders. They understood strategy, logistics, and morale. They commanded the respect of their soldiers, and they were often just as ruthless and determined as their husbands. They were defending their homes, their children, and their family's power. But some women went further. They didn't just command from behind the walls, they took to the field. The most famous example, of course, is Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from a small French village who claimed to hear the voices of saints telling her to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned as king. Joan's story is unique. She was not a noblewoman. She had no military training, but she had an unshakable faith and an incredible charisma. She convinced the French court to give her a chance. They gave her a suit of white armor, a banner, and a place at the head of the French army, and she led them to a series of stunning victories, most famously at the Siege of Orleans. Was Joan a knight? No, she was something stranger and more powerful, a prophet, a living saint, a symbol. The soldiers who followed her did not see her as a female version of a knight. They saw her as a messenger from God. Her power did not come from her skill with a sword, which was probably minimal. It came from the sheer force of her belief, which inspired a demoralized French army to believe in themselves and their cause again. Her story is not a story about a female knight. It's a story about how, in a world saturated with faith, a single individual with a powerful vision could shatter every rule of society. There were other, less famous examples. Women who fought in the Crusades, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who accompanied her first husband, King Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade, along with her own retinue of ladies and vassals. While they probably didn't fight in the front lines, they were a powerful presence on the campaign. The line between a female warrior and a knight was a firm one. The institution of chivalry was a male-only club, but the reality of medieval life, a life of constant endemic warfare, often forced women to step into roles that society had not designed for them. They were the exceptions that proved the rule. Their stories were told precisely because they were so shocking, so contrary to the expected order of things. They show us that the medieval world was not as simple or as rigid as we sometimes imagine. It was a world where a woman could be a commander, a leader, and in the rarest of cases, a warrior. They were not knights. They did not have the title or the ceremony, but many of them had the courage, the skill, and the iron will that defined the very essence of the warrior spirit. The image of the knight that we hold in our minds is not a photograph. It is a painting, a masterpiece of historical imagination, created not in the Middle Ages, but centuries later. The knight we know, the perfect, gentle knight of Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, the noble hero of pre-Raphaelite paintings, the gallant champion of Hollywood epics, is a fantasy. He is a product of the 19th century, a dream of the past, created by people who were deeply uncomfortable with their own present. The Victorian era in Britain, the 19th century, was an age of incredible change and upheaval. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the landscape. Cities were growing, choked with the smoke of factories. Society was being reshaped by new technologies, new money, and new social problems. It was a fast, dirty, and often brutal world, and many people, especially artists, writers, and thinkers, looked at this new industrial world and were horrified. They saw it as ugly, soulless, and devoid of the old certainties of faith and social order. So they looked backwards. They looked for a time that seemed simpler, purer, more heroic, and they found it in the Middle Ages, or rather, they invented it. They created a highly romanticized, deeply nostalgic, and wildly inaccurate version of the medieval past, a merry old England of quaint villages, grand cathedrals, and noble knights. This was the Gothic revival. It was an artistic and intellectual movement that fell in love with the Middle Ages. They rebuilt their churches in the Gothic style. They filled their homes with medieval-style furniture, and they filled their books and paintings with medieval themes. And at the heart of this medieval fantasy was the figure of the knight. But he was a new kind of knight, a Victorian knight. He was stripped of all the dirt, the debt, and the brutality of his historical reality. He was reimagined as a perfect gentleman, a Christian warrior who was brave, but also gentle, pious, but also romantic. He was the embodiment of all the virtues that the Victorians felt were missing from their own society: honor, duty, self-sacrifice, and a deep respect for women. Think of the paintings of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They are full of knights in impossibly shiny armor, rescuing damsels with flowing red hair. These are not historical documents. They are moral allegories. The knight is a symbol of righteous manhood. The damsel is a symbol of female purity. Think of Alfred, Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King, a massive epic poem that retold the story of King Arthur for a Victorian audience. His Lancelot is a tormented soul, torn between his love for Guinevere and his duty to his king. His Arthur is a tragic hero, a noble king whose perfect kingdom is brought down by human sin. This was not the rough, magical world of the original medieval romances. This was a story about Victorian morality, dressed up in medieval costume. This romantic reinvention of the knight was incredibly powerful, and it has stuck with us. The image it created is still the default setting for the knight in popular culture. When a movie shows us a knight who is honorable, articulate, and fighting for a just cause, that is not a medieval knight. That is a 19th century knight. This Victorian fantasy served a purpose. It was a form of social commentary. By creating an image of a perfect past, the Victorians could criticize the flaws of their own present. The chivalry they imagined was a yardstick against which they could measure the greed and materialism of the industrial age. But it also did a great disservice to history. It scrubbed the past clean. It turned the complex, contradictory, and often brutal reality of the medieval knight into a simple, two-dimensional cartoon hero. It replaced the smelly, illiterate, debt-ridden mercenary of history with a polite, well-spoken gentleman who probably wouldn't have survived a single day in a real medieval battle. So when we think of the knight, we are not remembering a historical reality. We are remembering a dream. A beautiful, powerful, and deeply misleading dream dreamt by a century that was afraid of its own reflection in the mirror of progress. The knight in shining armor is not a figure from the past. He is a ghost created to haunt a world that felt it had lost its soul. We have spent our time tonight in the company of these ghosts. We have looked beneath the shining armor, beyond the beautiful legends, and we have found a man who was often uncomfortable, usually in debt, and living by a code that was more fiction than fact. The image of the knight on his great war horse, the thundering charge that defined an era, is a powerful one, but it is an incomplete picture, because very often, the most effective thing a knight could do in a battle was get off his horse. The idea of the dismounted knight seems like a contradiction. The very word knight and its equivalents in French chevalier and German ritter is rooted in the word for horse. The knight was, by definition, a mounted warrior. His entire training, his social status, his military function was based on his mastery of the horse. To dismount was to give up his greatest advantage: his speed, his height, his mobility, and the terrifying shock power of the charge. So why would he ever do it? Because sometimes the horse was a liability. Sometimes the situation demanded a different kind of soldier, and the knight, for all his specialized training, had to be adaptable. The most common reason for a knight to dismount was in a defensive battle. Imagine you are part of an army that is outnumbered or has been forced to take up a position on a hill or behind a line of sharpened stakes. You are expecting the enemy to attack you. In this situation, a cavalry charge is useless. There is no room to maneuver. So what do? You dismount your knights. A dismounted knight was, in essence, an elite heavy infantryman. He was still wearing his 60 pounds of plate armor. He was still carrying a heavy shield and a long sword, or perhaps a poleaxe. He was a walking fortress. A line of dismounted knights, standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked together, was an incredibly tough defensive formation to break. They were the anchor of the battle line, the immovable object against which the enemy's attack would break. At famous battles like Crecy and Agincourt, the English knights and men-at-arms dismounted and took their place in the line alongside the longbowmen. They formed a solid steel core that the French cavalry charges could not penetrate. It was a smart, pragmatic tactic. It acknowledged that in this specific situation, the defensive power of heavy armor on foot was more valuable than the offensive power of a horse. Knights also dismounted in sieges. A horse is not a very useful tool for climbing a siege ladder or fighting in the narrow confines of a breached wall. In siege warfare, everyone was an infantryman. Knights would fight on the ramparts, in the towers, and in the bloody street-to-street fighting that followed a successful assault. Sometimes, a knight would dismount as a gesture of defiance and determination. A commander might order his knights to dismount at the start of a battle to signal that there would be no retreat. By getting off their horses, they were symbolically giving up their means of escape. They were sending a message to their own troops and to the enemy: we will stand and fight here, to the death if necessary. King Henry V did this at Agincourt, fighting on foot alongside his men. It was a powerful act of leadership. Of course, fighting on foot had its own dangers. As we've discussed, a knight who fell was incredibly vulnerable, and while he was a formidable opponent, he was also slow. A group of more nimble infantrymen with poleaxes or daggers could surround a dismounted knight and pull him down. But the image of the knight, always fighting on horseback, is a simplification. The reality was more complex. The medieval commander had to be flexible. He had to know when to use the thunderous power of the charge and when to use the unshakable resilience of a wall of steel. The dismounted knight represents this tactical flexibility. He is a reminder that the knight was not a one-trick pony. He was a professional soldier, and he understood that victory sometimes required him to abandon his most iconic weapon and get his armored feet dirty on the ground. He was a cavalryman who knew, when the time was right, how to become the bedrock of the infantry. So what is left when we strip away the Victorian romance, when we look past the literary myths, when we account for the brutal, smelly, and financially ruinous reality of the profession? What is the true legacy of the medieval knight? It is not chivalry. That was a beautiful fiction. It is not a legacy of protecting the weak. That was a cruel joke. The real, tangible legacy of the knight is written on the landscape of Europe. It is a legacy of stone and taxes. The most enduring physical legacy of the knightly age is the castle, the stone fortresses that still dot the countryside, from the shores of England to the hills of Syria. These were not the fairy tale palaces of Disney movies. They were the hubs of the entire feudal system. They were military bases, administrative centers, and symbols of raw, brutal power. A castle was the knight's office. It was the base of operations from which he controlled his land and the peasants who worked it. Its thick stone walls, its moat, its gatehouse, and towers. These were not just for defense against foreign enemies. They were a tool of internal control. They were a constant, looming reminder to the local population of who was in charge. The castle was a machine for projecting power, and this machine was incredibly expensive. To build and maintain a stone castle, to pay for its garrison, required a constant flow of income. And this brings us to the second, Less visible, but equally important legacy of the knight, the system of taxation that was created to support him. The entire feudal economy was designed to extract wealth from the agricultural base, the peasantry, and funnel it upwards to the warrior class. The system of fees, rents, and labor service that we talked about earlier was the economic engine that made the knightly class possible. These were not just random acts of extortion. They became a complex, legally codified system of fiscal oppression. The foundations of many modern European tax systems can be found in the feudal dues created to pay for a local lord's new suit of armor, or the construction of a new tower for his castle. So, the knight's true legacy is a paradox. He was a figure of chaos, a specialist in the destructive art of war. But in order to fund that chaos, his class created systems of order. They created sophisticated legal and financial structures to ensure their own survival. The castles they built were anchors of stability in a violent world, and the tax systems they created were the early ancestors of the modern state's bureaucracy. The knight himself has vanished. The thundering charge has been replaced by the roar of jet engines. But the structures he created to support himself are still with us, in the ruins of the castles that draw tourists by the million, and in the faint, bureaucratic echo of the tax codes that still govern our lives. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a complex and contradictory figure at the heart of a brutal and ingenious system, a system of violence paid for by a system of extraction. And that, perhaps, is the most honest way to remember him, not as a knight in shining armor, but as a man whose business was war, and whose legacy was the stone and the paperwork that made his business possible. And so our journey into the world of the knight comes to an end. We have seen the man beneath the armor, with all his discomforts and his fears. We have seen the beautiful lie of chivalry and the harsh reality of his finances. We have seen that his world was not one of grand romance, but of grim, practical survival. The legends are powerful. They speak to something in us that wants to believe in heroes, in honor, in a simpler, nobler time. But history is rarely simple, and it is almost never noble. The truth is often found in the quiet, uncomfortable details, the smell inside the helmet, the weight of the sword, the constant, nagging worry about money. The knight is gone, but his shadow remains, a long, armored shadow that stretches across our history and our imagination. It's a shadow we have filled with our own dreams, our own hopes for what a warrior could be. But now, perhaps, you can see the man who cast that shadow a little more clearly. Not a superhero, not a monster, just a man doing a difficult, dirty, and dangerous job in a world that was very different from our own. So now, let the clanging of the armor fade. Let the dust of the tournament field settle. Let the great stone walls of the castle dissolve into the quiet of the night. There are no more battles to be fought, no more debts to be paid, just the silence. Let that silence carry you now, down into a deep and peaceful rest. Good night.